Okay, welcome everybody again. This is going to be part two of our companion recording to our season of creation conversation that we had on September 22nd at the Wellspring in Arlington, Texas. So, for those of you that have taken a bit of time since part one, just as a quick reminder, we kind of went through some of the Season of Creation website information, looked at some aspects there of a fossil fuel treaty that plays a prominent role in those websites this year. And then we looked a little bit at some aspects of, say, product labeling and how that could make it difficult to make good choices in terms of products. There are some things that I probably didn't point out there, that there is some good progress being made in that area. Car manufacturers are trying to make some difference. There are some burgeoning efforts that may eventually result in more information to consumers eventually. But as of the moment, I just kind of wanted to make that point that it is a little bit difficult to make good decisions. So, with that, let's move forward. What I would like to do is now, for those of you intrepid enough to have stayed with me here, to make a little bit of a deeper dive into things that you can do personally. And then at the end of this, there is a nice link that we will see for a television show for those that want to look at this even deeper than I have here. So, carbon footprint calculators, I did not put a link here because if you Google that term, you will find pages upon pages. There are many out there that let you compute them many different ways. Some let you specify what part of the country you're in, others don't. A lot to choose from, but very easy for you to go out and find one of these, plug your own personal numbers in, get an idea of where you might be able to make lifestyle choices if you're interested. There is information out there. So I just wanted to make that point. I did use one to get to this stage. So our best guess today, as this seems to be fairly common among a series of the different websites, is that the average American expels, maybe through their actions, is a good way to phrase it, about 16 tons of CO2 emissions each year. So doing all of your varying activities. So what I would like to do is step through kind of the bigger hitters in that, and then we can spend a bit of time discussing those. So food choice may not seem like an obvious one right up front, but as it turns out, there are some pieces of information there to understand. The auto industry has gotten a lot of focus recently. Electric vehicles, charging, range issues, lots to discuss there. Probably spend a little bit more time there than the others since it has been so much in the news to date. Plane travel. The airline industry is simply operating an aircraft, put it this way, uses very high energy fuel. Airline jet fuel, when burned, puts out more CO2 than, say, gasoline or coal or other different sources. And a jet, when in operation, expels a lot of CO2. As a planetary issue, this is not a significant portion of the problem, though, just simply because there isn't as much plane travel compared to other different sources of CO2. However, for the average American individual, it is a significant portion of their expenditure. So we'll spend a little bit of time talking about that. Your home is probably the biggest single one. I won't belabor this actually very much. I've got a couple of links that you can spend a good deal of time with. And we've actually, as a society, been talking about this a great deal since the 1970s, back when we were having energy crises and struggling getting gasoline from the Middle East and all those various different problems, and discussions about, oh, if you're patriotic if you turn your house temperature up 2 degrees or whatever. So there's been a lot of information through time. So I'll point you to a couple of links, but we won't spend a whole lot of time talking about that here in this presentation, because there is so much information that you can research on. And then the final component for the average American is pretty much anything you buy. Anything from a cell phone to a couch to a hotel room. There is an associated carbon emission, some way, somehow associated with that, either directly in your use of it or in the cost to manufacture it. So there are calculators out there that utilize the dollar value of what you buy as a proxy for that. That's a pretty rough number. I didn't find a lot of concrete information here that was super helpful. So I'm not really going to spend too much time on this. I just will make a point that there are calculators out there that can help you look at this if you're particularly interested in that aspect of your carbon footprint. So let's start with food. A lot of people may not kind of realize, but your food choices can impact your impact on the environment. This particular chart tries to capture it here. If you see the term meat lover over on the left-hand side, that would be a very protein-rich diet, but it's more complex than that. So we'll actually look at that in a little bit more detail. The average would be considered an average American. So that would be any of us, and what we as an average American typically eat results in about 2.5 tons per year. The no beef diet, and we'll get into a little detail as to why that and why beef is being picked on here. It does tend to cut out a fair amount. So if you kind of notice a trend here, it'll be a little bit more obvious later, but beef is kind of an issue. And if you cut out animal products altogether into a vegetarian or even vegan type diet, then your footprint goes down even more still, although not as much as pure beef. So without further ado, let's discuss that a bit. So I have a chart here that talks about the food supply chain. Not easy to say. So the food supply chain has components in each aspect of it in terms of a carbon emission cost. Down below you see the words beef herd and sugar. So these two terms, one is a kind of one of the most expensive animals, beef, which you kind of saw on the last page, and then sugarcane. Sugarcane is one of the more expensive, not the most, but one of the more expensive plant-based products. So we're going to do a little bit of a comparison here. So land use, that's the first aspect of the food chain. So if you weren't, say for instance, growing cattle in a pasture or growing sugarcane in a field, then that land would be doing something else. And if it were turned back to nature, typically you would see something akin to trees in a forest, or possibly a grassland, long grassland or something that would have a certain aspect of carbon that it absorbs. All of our plant products are really where the CO2 comes out of the atmosphere and gets put back into the planet. It's really plants and in the ocean are the two aspects that kind of make that happen. So if you were to not do something like grow beef, what would that land be doing instead? So that's really what this cost is. Beef tend to be expensive because there is a practice of heavily grazing these pastures. So there isn't nearly as much grass as there would be if it were more of a natural setting. And of course, that is a lot less carbon dioxide absorption than what you would see in a treed area. So sugarcane, same kind of thing, is that it doesn't absorb CO2 quite as well as what a natural plant environment would look like. So there is a cost with that, but it is considerably lower than what you see with cattle. Now if we add in farm aspects, so this is things like running farm equipment, fertilizer, just what happens in terms of actually keeping, say, animals in a pasture, what is going on there. So sugarcane is a little more expensive than most plant products because it is heavily fertilized. So that aspect does tend to add to its carbon footprint. But in the case of the beef herd, it's, again, exceptionally expensive. Primarily, it's kind of a memed joke, as it were, but it's the actual emissions from the animals, the methane that comes from their excretions. As it turns out, ungulates are much more extensive in terms of the methane that they produce compared to, say, chickens or pork or other animal products that Americans tend to consume. If you were to compare them, say, to horses or water buffalo or camels, well, then those are ungulates as well. But of course, we don't grow those and eat those, so they're not on our typical American diet, as it were. Feed is something that you're really only going to see with animal products. Obviously, you don't need to feed outside of the fertilizer that were covered in the farm cost. In the case of animals, you would tend to have chicken feed or hay or something added to the animal's diet in order to be able to grow them. In the case of cattle, that's not very expensive. There is a little bit in terms of hay growth, but other than that, they tend to be fed much more grass-fed options rather than other different types. Processing is always going to be a bit more expensive for animals than it is for plants typically. So again, you see here the beef line is getting longer and longer. By the way, the longer this line is, the more expensive it is in terms of CO2 emissions. I think I may have mentioned that at the beginning. So at that point, processing is more expensive for animals. Transport begins to level out because if you note, our units here is 1 kilogram of product. So moving 1 kilogram of sugar is about the same as 1 kilogram of beef. So at that point, whether you're flying it or shipping it via some kind of ground transport truck, whatever, there's a little additional cost in that typically protein products you have to air condition, but other than that, the transport cost is pretty standard. Most Americans buy their food in grocery stores. So again, our retail cost in terms of CO2 is going to be about the same for all of our different products. And then the packaging for the various products is going to be pretty much the same as well. So the tail end of the food chain is really not the food supply chain is really not where the cost occurs. The cost varying between the different food choices tends to be more on the farm itself, actually producing, say, the pound of beef or the pound of mutton or the pound of sugarcane. That really is where the difference occurs, is in the early stages of the supply chain. So this data that I used to source this came from a website called Our World in Data. I will put a link for that to the video, and that is a wonderful website in terms of finding a lot of this type of information out that is not easily found elsewhere. These kinds of things are not as obvious generally just on the internet in general. they do pull this information together rather nicely in this website. So it's a good place to go if you're kind of interested in geeking out on this kind of stuff. One of the observations that I made from this particular study is that beef is about 10 times more expensive to other animal products than Americans eat, like pork and chicken, due to the methane produced by the cattle in the pasture. That's pretty much what the difference is. So that's why beef, and when you see it on that prior chart when it said meat lovers, or if you cut beef out of your diet, that makes a significant difference in the CO2 emissions of your diet choices. And as you could probably guess, the good stuff like chocolate and coffee are the most expensive plant products. Of course, you're not going to see things like asparagus and broccoli top the list. It's going to be coffee and chocolate. But as you can see here, the study is sort of interesting in that in the chocolate case, it really is more due to what would the land be doing otherwise if you weren't growing chocolate. In the case of the coffee, it's the actual things you do to the coffee plants themselves, primarily fertilizing them, that extends their particular costs. So just a couple of random observations there, looking at this particular website. So let's move on to automobiles. So automobiles are in the news a lot lately due to electric vehicles. So let's examine that maybe a little bit more detail. So I had an example earlier about automobiles, and I kind of utilized a standard vehicle here, being a four-door Honda Accord, as being a little bit of a baseline. And if you look at that at about 250 miles a week, I don't know if you consider that to be a heavy use. That's about 13,000 miles a year. Probably, I would guess that the person driving this much is commuting across town. They probably drive a fair amount on the weekend to activities, or maybe even short road trips or out of town to a state park or something. So that's probably about how you get to 250 miles a week. So basing that on a 27 mile per gallon gas vehicle, that's about 4.45 tons a year. Converting to a hybrid would reduce that number. Again, this is a typical hybrid. Would reduce that number down to about 2.5, typically, maybe 2.6 to be precise. So it does save some because there is electric usage, and just simply the miles per gallon is better. So the gasoline that you do burn in your hybrid is just simply less gasoline to get you from point A to point B. And then electric vehicles bring that number down to about 1.44. And so you might be asking, why is that number not zero? Since the actual operation of the electric vehicle does not produce emissions. So when you're actually moving, you don't have any emissions. However, that electricity does have to come from somewhere, and that's where this particular estimate is arrived at, is that our electrical generation today does produce CO2. Ergo, there is a CO2 cost with operating an EV vehicle. Now, these are operating costs, not what it takes to manufacture these vehicles or anything else. Just simply what it takes when they're in your hands and you're driving them around. So electric vehicles, as I said, have been in the news a lot. It's been pointed out that they're not really any more or less expensive in carbon to produce than gas vehicles, because they are reliant upon a lot of different metals to make the batteries, and those have to come from typically kind of remote places. There are some places in South America where you can get a lot of lithium, and that it does take a lot more to get out to that location to mine that in order to make batteries. The batteries themselves have had a lot of critique recently. That's a little bit more of an American thing. Don't get between American and their road trip, particularly a summer road trip. And that is an issue. I think a lot of the EVs are fine for people when they're driving around town, getting back and forth to work, grocery store, etc. But once you decide it's time to go to Yellowstone, now how do you do that with an electric vehicle? Generation, I just mentioned that a moment ago. The video at the end of the presentation, I think, does a really nice job if you're interested in this particular topic and what is being done, outside of what an individual could do. Obviously, we can't go out and build a better power generation plant individually. That's at more of a societal level. And so if you're interested in innovation happening there, the video at the end of this particular presentation would be a good place to start. And then finally, charging stations. If you had a Genie Wish and you decided to expel your Genie Wish on making every car in the country an electric vehicle in the blink of an eye, the very first problem is that we would have social unrest at the charging stations because no one could get around because there aren't enough charging stations. So that's been a bit of an issue recently and would probably need to be addressed as we get to wider term adoption. So there's another aspect to if you had used the Genie Wish, as I described it, and made every car an electric vehicle. Our car fleet, if you take every car in America and lined them all up and said, what is the electrical burden of those vehicles? It's not very high because you do have a few electrical vehicles, but you have a lot more gas driven. And so the actual power used to move those vehicles during the day comes much more so from burning gasoline than electricity. When you convert everything to electrical vehicles in order to try to curb emissions, now suddenly you have a huge electricity burden because we're going to be charging everything all at once. So we don't want to make the problem worse by wide-scale EV adoption and not be ready to generate the electricity in a clean way. So I think that is something, again, that video at the end that I reference talks on this topic, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it now. So Tesla had a vision. It was the first place I saw it. It's obviously not Tesla's vision. Other manufacturers can support this as well. But the idea is if you had an adoption where, in addition to electric vehicles, people were to, say, generate their own electricity through putting solar panels on their roofs and then batteries in their garages. So why would you need a battery in the garage? The issue is that most people, well, I don't want to say most people, many people, their cars are not at home in the middle of the day. They're out doing their activities, they're at work, they're doing what they do. They come home in the evening, and by then the sun is going down and the power coming from the panels is not very great. And so that's the perfectly wrong time to charge a car if you're going to do it straight from the solar panels. And that's where the battery comes in. So the battery would then be something that would store store power coming off of the solar panels that are generating it during the day. And then at night, that same power can then be given back to, in this case, recharging the car. So in theory, you could take care of your daily needs for driving around as a off-the-grid type of situation where you wouldn't be adding to the electrical generation burden of society, and that you would be generating enough of your own electricity. Now, obviously, this is expensive for people that, to kind of get into. However, the government does supply tax credits. I will provide a link for that if you are interested in this kind of thing. In that all of this applies for these governmental tax credits. So tax credits, if you're familiar with the term, that's just money straight off your tax bill. It's not like a deduction. It does come straight off the bottom line. So it is a very powerful thing to keep in mind. if you want to do this. I mean, you certainly don't want to go and put up solar panels or buy a car or a Powerwall without applying for those tax credits. That would be a bad idea. But obviously, if you're it's only a percentage, so it's still going to cost to make a change, a lifestyle change like this. So I think this vision is probably, or something similar to it needs to happen for us to get to a point where we actually transition into electric vehicles and then also manage to not kill our electrical generation system at the same time. Now, another aspect that has troubled the electrical vehicle industry is simply range. So I kind of referred to that a minute ago in that EV cars are probably great for most people driving around town. There are now SUVs, there are pickup trucks, there are regular standard sedan cars. So most of the types of cars that people drive are available in EV form one way or another. The problem comes when you begin to drive across the country. So if you stick to the big interstates and charge your vehicle periodically as you go, this is something that can be done. You may run across an article that shows somebody driving a Tesla from Los Angeles to New York and said, hey, it's not that bad. I stuck to the main interstates and I saw everything. But if you tend to hit the back roads, if you tend to spend time on smaller highways and not the big interstates, finding charging stations could be difficult. So there has been a movement now in several different companies to try to address this. So I'm going to highlight two here. One is a company called Arnext Energy, or ONE, and they have taken a standard battery pack that you would put into a Tesla Model S, and they did this. They took a portion of it and put in the normal kind of battery chemistry, the lithium-based battery chemistry that you see in pretty much all electrical vehicles today. What that does is it provided the car excellent power, excellent performance, worked really well for about 120 miles, which probably captures most people's daily usage. So a typical person who's just driving back and forth to work, maybe to the grocery store, wouldn't notice the difference between this battery and a off-the-shelf battery that comes with the Model S. But what they did is they added a second component. All of the space that they got from removing the core battery, they replaced with what they referred to as a range battery. Now, in the experiment that they ran, and at the moment, I don't think we're anywhere near yet being able to buy one of these, but in the experiment that they ran, they left Detroit, they drove up to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and then drove back. That was a little bit more than 600 miles, and they did it without having to recharge. Now, there were some limitations. I believe when they were on the highway, they had to drive not too much more than about 55 miles an hour, which isn't going to scratch the itch for most Texans trying to get from Dallas to Austin. But in general, for them, it did show hope. And this is kind of this plug-in hybrid concept, even though this is all electric, with the idea that your normal everyday usage could be addressed in one way, and then maybe there's an additional capability for when you want to take a road trip. Another example, the Dodge Ram Charger. I'm not personally really a pickup guy or a Dodge guy, but I did notice in the research that Ram Charger is an old name that Dodge used for years. So back in the 70s, they had a pickup truck called the Ram Charger, and I think they dug that name out because obviously when you're talking about an EV, Ram Charger now has a new meaning. So this is a new vehicle that's coming out next year. It has a traditional electric vehicle drivetrain. So in that regard, it's a motor at each wheel. It is not a hybrid in the sense of the word that we think of hybrids today. in which case a gasoline or electric engine kind of work, the motors and the engine kind of work together in the drivetrain. So this vehicle is intended to recharge on a nightly basis, periodic basis via a plug, and you could use it at charging stations. And so it will recharge the batteries that are in there. So up until this point, everything that you see is a standard electric vehicle approach, such as you might see with any other electric pickup truck. Now, what they have done here differently is that in a typical electric pickup truck, the hood itself is a little bit different, well, a lot different, in that there is no engine there. So typically you get maybe a trunk of sorts. They call it a frunk because it's in front. And you could, put a little bit of stuff up there if you wanted to, a little bit of storage, because there is no gas engine. That's not the case here. In this vehicle, they've put a V6 engine. So the V6 engine is intended only to charge the battery. So it isn't intended to drive the car. So what happens is as you get out onto the road for an extensive road trip, as the battery begins to go down, the user can engage the engine will come on, and it will act solely as an electrical charger, but a pretty efficient one. So you carry around your own charging station in the form of a V6 engine. So you are obviously going to pay for this in complexity. The car is going to be a lot heavier carrying around this engine when you're not using it. So there's some cost. It's obviously not a perfect solution, but it is representative of some of the things that are happening today for people that want to buy a vehicle but have to have it be able to take extensive road trips. This particular vehicle, I think, also has a very high tow rating. So I think it doesn't limit you in that regard either, as some EVs tend to do. So again, I'm not really promoting either of these options, the prior one or this one. I'm just pointing out here as information that there is innovation happening. There are people that are actively trying to help solve the problem on a day-to-day basis. So in that regard, again, much more of the first fruits, as it were. So let's transition over into airplane travel. As I pointed out at the beginning, air travel is a significant percentage of a typical American person's CO2 footprint, but not really the whole world. So in that regard, it's an area to deal with, but it's not quite as big as, say, the prior topics of food and or personal transportation. The airline industry has been working on this problem. Now, to be fair, what they were really working on is saving gasoline in order to be able to save money. But as it turned out, that has also managed to save the carbon footprint, because generally speaking, a carbon-based vehicle, miles per gallon, is a very good measure of this type of expenditure. And the jet fuel that is used today is the same jet fuel that was used in 1990. So the only way that you get a 50% improvement is to actually have a 50% more efficient vehicle. So per passenger, the number has come down considerably. However, from a planetary perspective, we're flying so much more. We have more people, more airplanes, more airports. So in that regard, the total industry is still growing and putting out a lot more CO2 than it did in years past. It's just doing it at a little bit more of an efficient rate per passenger. So let's take an example. So this is in Europe. So this particular piece of information I got from Eurostar, so it probably is a little bit of cherry picking here. But Eurostar is a high-speed electric train service that operates in Europe. And this particular piece of information was for passengers that were interested in getting from London to different points on the European continent, like Paris or Amsterdam. So they were comparing the actual CO2 emissions related to a train trip for an individual versus a plane trip for an individual to get from London to Paris. And as you can see, the numbers, 2.4 compared to 66, is a massively different component. So what this kind of points out is that electric train travel is much more efficient in shorter ranges. Certainly something that could be done in an afternoon or a couple of hours, something akin to that. The train is a much more efficient option than the airplane. As you get longer distances, then that begins to change. Now, in America, this is a little bit of a different picture because we aren't currently blessed, as it were, with a large quantity of high-speed electric train travel. So this kind of alternative for someone wanting to get, say, from Dallas to Houston is not currently available. There is some efforts. I do believe that sometime in the next 100 years, this may come to fruition, and this kind of choice may be made by people wanting to get from Dallas to Houston. But at the moment, you don't have that particular train choice to do it. So let's talk about one that is more of a typical American version of this same problem. So this is a trip to get from Philadelphia to Boston using the current options available to most people. So what you can see is that there are trains. These happen to not be high-speed electric, but there are trains. So this would be public transportation to get from Philadelphia to Boston, that 300 miles. So in kilograms, that puts out about 50 kilograms per passenger. That is typical. Obviously, the train sometimes has a few more people and a few less, but on average, it's about 50 kilograms per person. The air travel, comparatively, is about 184. So this would be a short haul flight to get from point A to point B. So it could probably be one of the smaller aircraft in use, but still on a per passenger basis, it's a little bit more than 3 times as expensive from a CO2 perspective. The interesting case being a private car. Now, the private car that they used for this study was a typical 27 mile to the gallon gasoline burning vehicle. This is not a special car, not an EV, nothing akin to that. So that particular car would expend about 104 kilograms to get this trip done. But the interesting point is that doesn't really change with the number of people in the vehicle, slightly maybe, but for the most part, it's going to be about that same number if you had 2 people in the car, 3 people, 4 people. So if you are making a trip that has at least 2 people in it, as you can see, the private car now is actually the best choice. As you add more people to the car, it gets even more so. Because if you say it had 2 people flying, now you have to take the 184 and double it, or in the case of the train, the 50 and double it. Whereas in the case of the private car, you take the 104 and you divide it by 2. So cars are still one of the very most efficient, and obviously our previous conversation about electric vehicles is something to kind of keep in mind. So I think eventually the United States will get around to potentially embracing trains, but given the more spread out condition of the country, that is a little bit more of a prospect to build all of the train line and infrastructure and everything needed to support an electric train going, say, from New York to Chicago than it would be from London to Paris, a lot more distance. But the shorter distances, like this trip, I could see being supported by high-speed electric over time. So let's transition into home. As I kind of mentioned up front, I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time here because there is so much information online. It's very easy for people to go out and look at what you might do in your home. People have recommendations out there from checking the ceiling in a window to make sure that the airflow is contained, all the way up to buying better air conditioners. But the one thing I did want to point out is that if you look at a typical home, these four items consume most of the electricity or potentially natural gas that you expend in keeping a home. So hot water heaters, clothes dryers, refrigerators, and buying better and more efficient versions of each of those three are going to do a lot more for your bottom line CO2 emissions than, say, for instance, a dishwasher or something else. So just keeping that in mind. But obviously, the heating and cooling, I think this would probably be not a surprise to anyone, that air conditioning and heating in different parts of the country are really the most expensive component aspect of it. So let's talk about a couple things here, and then we'll get to my last recommendation. So there are a lot of sites. Here is one link. I kind of called it oldies but goodies, but if you went and followed this link, there's everything here from the savings of turning your thermostat up a degree all the way to putting in a much more efficient air conditioner, converting to a heat pump. All different kinds of things are discussed in that particular list. And then the one thing I did want to mention is the clean energy tax credits. They've gone up. They are now actually at a level where it really will be significantly taking a component out of a particular purchase, whether it be solar panels, new windows, doors. There are credits for all of those. And they will stay in place currently up till 2035. So anything that you might be doing in the next 10 years in this area, certainly consult this list and make sure that you are getting all of the tax credits that you are due. So one thing I did want to point out, and this is a experiment, I would call it at the moment. It's not super broadly erected, but this is in Paris, France. So they have a system they've built in part of downtown. And what it does is it forces air down into the ground. Underneath the ground, they've created some repositories that are a combination of water and air. And so basically what happens is they are taking advantage of the fact that as you get beneath the ground, the typical temperature is about 55 degrees Fahrenheit. It changes a little bit depending on the area of the country you're in, but this is remarkably consistent. If you've ever visited a cave in the summer, if the cave is deep at all, you tend to note that you have to bring a jacket, even if it's 108 outside in the middle of July. So they're taking advantage of that particular case here, and they're forcing the air down and cooling it in these lower containers. And then actually, as the forced air brings that cool air up, it then is just sort of, I don't want to say pumped, but it just kind of flows into various different structures. So it's not quite like we think of an air conditioner where it's blowing air on you and air is coming out of the vent. It's really just more the cool air is just coming from this subterranean area into some of these buildings. And they do report that it works actually quite well. I think on a super high humidity day, the kind of thing you might find around here occasionally or in Florida a lot, this probably doesn't work nearly as well as it does there in Paris. But I think a lot of the country could benefit from this. The cost was a little vague in some of the information that I saw, so I don't really know how much they had to expend to get this built and set up in the first place. I kind of think they took advantage maybe of some of the subway tunnels that they already had. So I think in that regard, they were really looking to reuse something that was already there. I think if you went to, say, downtown Arlington, Texas, and proposed drilling into the ground and putting these kinds of containers there, it probably wouldn't be very cost effective. But it just is an interesting note that there are people out there that are thinking differently, thinking outside the box in order to try to solve the problem. So, great segue to this particular program. This is a PBS program from the Nova series. If you're a Nova fan, you may have even seen this. I believe this was last year. Yes, it looks like April of last year this was aired. And it basically goes through a little less than an hour. So you do have a little bit of a commitment there. But it goes through innovations all across the map. Everything from different ways to cook, all the way up to different ways of harvesting wind, harvesting solar power, batteries, storing energy is a huge issue. All of these areas have significant innovations. A lot of these do come from academic sources, so you will tend to find a lot of college professors kind of in the middle of this. But at the time, it does talk about a lot of different things that are happening, and this is a little of what I meant at the beginning of the video, is that it is easy to fall into the trap of thinking that this is a huge problem that no one's addressed yet, and we're at the very beginning and we're just starting, and oh my God, what are we going to do? It isn't that bad. In this particular video, one of the experts does tend to indicate that at least in the United States, the developed portion of it, being the larger cities, that in his assessment, we are about 18% of the problem has been solved. So that's obviously a lot more to go. We need to keep pushing, but there are a lot of things to get excited about, and there are a lot of things to know about what's going on. It's not quite as bad an issue as it sometimes gets portrayed in the news. So I encourage you to go look at this video, at least a little bit of it, and see what you think if you are interested in this topic. I think there are some hopeful stuff in here that will help you, particularly if you're very depressed. if you're looking at the problem, and it's easy to do in North Texas when it's way hotter than it used to be. But at the same time, I do encourage you to look here and see what kinds of things are happening out in the world. So with that, that brings us to a conclusion